According to the International Encyclopedia of Political Science, quote, self-determination is a highly contentious concept that encompasses a variety of meanings and political claims. Each of these claims is based on the theory that particular population groups possess an inherent right to control their own political institutions. Self-determination is exercised in ways that include self-governance, democracy, and freedom from outside influence and pressure. It is both a norm of international law and a political principle, and it's related to concepts of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and democracy. It has internal and external aspects. In essence, self-determination is the rights of peoples to freely determine their own destiny, in particular their own political status, economic, cultural, and social development. The rights of self-determination is recognized in international law as belonging to peoples and not to states or governments. The natural questions that comes up are, who are the peoples that have the rights of self-determination? How is self-determination implemented? And the last question, what does self-determination mean today? Furthermore, self-determination has evolved within the past century. And in order to answer the questions and fully understand self-determination, it's important to understand the historical context in which the right of self-determination has evolved. It can be divided into roughly 3 periods. The age of nationalism, from the late 18th century to the Great World Wars. The second phase, the age of decolonization, post-World War II to the end of the late 20th century, when the United Nations refined self-determination from what it was understood earlier. The third phase, the post-colonial, is what we are in now, where claims of self-determination conflicts with the principle of territorial integrity. Nationalism is a highly contested concept, and in a general sense, quote, nationalism is a strong attachment to a nation as a human collective. A nation, another contested concept, in a general sense, is a community of people united based on real or perceived characteristics such as culture, ethnicity, language, history, citizenship, etc. With the rise of nationalism in Europe in the 18th century, European nationalists advanced self-determination in a collectivist sense by arguing that all nations were entitled to the rights of self-determination, the right to form their own state. They seek to create national states out of the large multi-ethnic empires such as Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. This nationalist conceptualization of self-determination saw the rights belonging to the nation, which was based on ethnicity, language, history, and cultural heritage. Perhaps the most well-known advocate of self-determination was US President Woodrow Wilson, who argued that there could be no justice or order if nations were denied the right to self-determination. He articulated this political vision for the new European order in a series of speeches known as the 14 Points Address, the 4 Principles, the 4 Ends, and the 5 Particulars. However, it's important to understand that self-determination at this time was a political principle and not accepted as an international norm or right by many other states. It was only applied to newly formed states and to the defeated powers after World War I. The term self-determination didn't even make it into the covenants of the League of Nations. Self-determination wouldn't be an international norm until post-World War II, where it became part of the United Nations Charter in Article 1 and 55. In the UN Charter, the references to self-determination were very vague and referred to principles of equal rights and self-determination of people, without explanation of what that exactly meant. This would change in the 1960s, where self-determination soon became understood as a norm of international law. The key document to illustrate what self-determination came to mean was the Declaration of Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, adopted by the General Assembly, Resolution 1514 of December 14, 1960. Within a decade, its provisions became accepted as customary law by all United Nations members. The declaration states, quote, "The subjugation of peoples to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights, is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, and is an impediment to the promotion of world peace and cooperation." The second paragraph is the one that became the expression of the norm of self-determination in international law. Quote, "All peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural developments." That paragraph made its way in positive international law when the General Assembly directed that it be included in the first article of the two Covenants of Human Rights in 1966. An important question is, what did the article mean by all peoples? Does it mean that every ethnic group have the right to self-determination? Did peoples refer to only peoples of colonial territories? Well, the more than 50 cases of self-determination makes it very clear that self-determination was territorial and applied to entire populations of external colonial territories. It is not the same as the national self-determination claims of the mid-18th and early 20th century. Self-determination became a right for colonized peoples of geographically distinct, non-self-governing territories. The development of self-determination being linked to non-self-governing territories can be traced back to Article 73 of the UN Charter, which created a sacred trust between non-self-governing territories and the administering powers, whereas the administering power will develop the territory until it became self-governing. It loosely described non-self-governing territories as, quote, "territories whose peoples have not yet attained a full measure of self-government." This definition is vague at best and contains no specific criteria for knowing when a non-self-governing territory has attained a full measure of self-government. In 1952, UN Resolution 637 titled "The Rights of Peoples and Nations to Self-Determination" linked self-determination with non-self-governing territories. This made it clear that defining non-self-governing territory, which is in essence who would be recognized as possessing the right to self-determination. There were two main camps that had different positions on what constituted a non-self-governing territory. Those who advocated the saltwater thesis argued that only external colonies or non-self-governing territories who are geographically distinct, separated by blue water from the colonizer, have the right to self-determination. In opposition to the saltwater thesis, the Belgian thesis argued that the concept of non-self-governing territories should also apply to non-geographically distinct colonies, to internal colonized peoples within the borders of independent states. In the end, the saltwater thesis won, as many states did not want their own contiguous territories broken up. The saltwater thesis was enshrined in UN Resolution 1541 of December 15, 1960, titled "Principles which should guide members in determining whether or not an obligation exists to transmit the information called for under Article 73E of the Charter. Explain what a non-self-governing territory is. Territories which are known to be a colonial type, quote, geographically separate and is distinct ethnically, and/or culturally from the country administering it, and the relationship between the metropolitan state and the territory concerned in a manner which arbitrarily places the latter in a position or status of subordination. Therefore, subgroups within already existing sovereign states or in newly independent colonies had no UN-sanctioned right to self-determination. For example, in 1960, when Katanga declared its secession from Congo, the state of Katanga was not formally recognized by the international community as legitimate, and the UN backed the central government of Congo. Another example is Biafra, which broke off from Nigeria in 1967. The majority of the people of Biafra were ethnically Igbo, distinct from the other ethnic groups in Nigeria, and they wanted their own state. However, once again, their state was largely unrecognized by the international community and subsequently reintegrated with Nigeria in 1970 after a bloody civil war. Furthermore, Resolution 1541 outlines the three political status options that satisfy a non-self-governing territory to reaching full self-governance. Quote, "A non-self-governing territory can be said to have reached a full measure of self-government by A. Emergence as a sovereign independent state, B. Free association with an independent state, C. Integration with an independent state." In 1970, Resolution 2625, titled "The Declarations on Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and Cooperation Among States," restated and confirmed customary international law and the 1960 declarations. It also expanded the options that fulfilled self-determination. Quote, "Any other political status freely determined by a people." Thus, a political principle of national self-determination based on history, cultural, and ethnicity been transformed into a norm of international law to that meant of territorial decolonization, a shift from a nation-based argument for self-determination to a decolonization-based argument. To summarize, quote, "The principle of national self-determination has enjoyed a measure of international support since the mid-20th century, recognized by the United Nations but tightly circumscribed to apply only to existing states or to colonial territories, by the saltwater doctrine whereby colonies are by definition separated from the colonizer by a sea, and not to nationalist movements within consolidated states, especially when these are democracies." While it seems intuitive to think that self-determination is implemented through a referendum, whereas the eligible people directly vote for their preferred political status, the majority of self-determination referendums were held after the 1990s. Up until then, the majority of colonies were granted independence by the administering powers, either willingly, such as Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, or only after wars of national liberation, such as Angola and Indochina, thus implementing the rights of self-determination, decolonization, and satisfying the requirement of self-governance. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, referendums became common, possibly due to Western powers pressuring for referendums in order to recognize new states. With the right of self-determination being internationally recognized as a right for colonized peoples in geographically distinct territories, what does self-determination mean today, in a post-colonial world where most of the world has decolonized, with an exception of a few cases? The right to self-determination has been a common assertion by secessionist movements who argue that the provisions of Resolution 1514 apply in their cases. They claim that they suffer from alien subjugation and therefore their claims should be thought of the same way as the colonial peoples. They seek to create a new right, where any identifiable cultural group has the right to self-determination from existing states. Examples of such secessionist movements include Quebec, Basque Country, or unrecognized states such as South Ossetia and Northern Republic of Cyprus. While international law is officially silent on the issue of unilateral secession, neither approving nor prohibiting secession, the international community consistent reaction to unilateral secession is a rejection of these states. However, for consensual secession such as South Sudan or the states that emerged after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the international community recognizes these types of consensual secession. The exception to this norm is Kosovo, which I will not discuss. So far, I only talked about self-determination in an external sense, meaning political status change, exercise in the rights of becoming an independent sovereign state, freely associating with another state, integrating with a state, or any other political status. There is another aspect of self-determination that is internal, the rights of the people to freely govern themselves without outside interference. And second, that there are rights that all peoples have within a state. This is especially important for minorities, where the rights of internal self-determination include some level of autonomy, political, cultural, civil, and religious rights. This is related to the rights of indigenous peoples to self-determination. In 2007, the UN adopted the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in Article 3, the same language in Resolution 1514 of 1960 is used, with the only difference being, instead of all peoples, it said that indigenous peoples have the rights of self-determination. Quote, "Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development." However, Article 46 of the Declaration clarifies that the indigenous peoples have the rights of internal self-determination, but not external self-determination. Quote, "Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, or construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which should dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states," meaning the indigenous peoples and minorities have no right of unilateral secession to form their own state or some other form of political status. In the beginning, I asked the questions: who are the peoples that have the rights of self-determination? How is self-determination implemented? And what does self-determination mean today? The answers are quite clear. It's colonized peoples of geographically distinct territories that have the rights of self-determination in an external sense, which is implemented through the people freely determining whatever political status they desire, ranging from integration with a sovereign state to becoming an independent state. Referendums became the common method of achieving this after the 1990s. And the right of self-determination today is asserted by secessionist movements all around the world, as well as internal self-determination with respect to the indigenous peoples and minorities. The former is rejected by the international community, while the latter is accepted. Consensual secession: the people of the seceding territory can express self-determination. However, there still remains a small number of cases where external self-determination is applicable today as it was in the age of decolonization. There are 17 of such cases in which the United Nations General Assembly deemed to be non-self-governing and subject to the decolonial process and thus entitled to the rights of self-determination. Guam, the island that I call home, is one of them, a place that has been under colonial control by different masters since the 1600s. with the United States being the current colonizer since 1898. In the next video, I will discuss how this self-determination applied to Guam. Zeus Masi for watching. This is Pulan, and Pulan has spoken. Esta.